It's Melanie speaking. Thank you so much, Melissa, for that fascinating webinar. And it, as you were talking about different points, I was thinking about different clients that I've had across the years and kind of going, plenty of food for thought there. Yes, as Melissa said, we invite our audience to put their questions in the Q&A function. If you are an Auslan user and would like to ask a question in Auslan, please put Auslan question in the Q&A and we will arrange for camera access for you so you can sign your question. So we have a couple of questions come through. First one is, have you used any of the assessments you mentioned, and do you find them better than others for assessment of people with deaf blindness? Or do you use a more informal assessment process of your observations?
One thing that's really important is, as I said, unfortunately, a lot of the assessment tools that are quite objective are really poorly able to be used within our deafblind community because of the complex sensory deficits that our community members have. I would tend, the ones I've practiced and the ones I have worked with an OT here on, we were looking at more the clinical pathway. And that is an observation because there is nothing at all that stops observation being such an important part. If you don't sit and just be with an individual and observe what they're doing, you'll miss so much information. Part of that observation is also gaining that information from family members, from support staff around the individual. So really, you should have a package of that observation skills first, prior to then using your clinical pathway assessment, which was the table that I demonstrated. So I would tend to use more the full pathway, but in the presence of already gaining this observation from those around the individual. Because remembering, and therapists particularly have to remember, they are not necessarily the specialist when it comes to that individual. They have skill set that can support, but the family members, any of the support people around that individual, the educators, all form a wonderful team around that individual. So if you miss out on that observation, you will not be able to then do your clinical pathways correctly.
Terrific. And it's Melanie speaking. I like the shout out for that multidisciplinary approach and gathering information and perspectives from all around the client and from different fields as well. I think that I can imagine the kind of conversations that go on as you discuss various theories and observations and their meanings and interpretations of those observations. There's another question here. Thanks for the great presentation. What do you think is the next step for research about interoception and I'm going to maybe even interoception in deaf blindness?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And Mr. David Brown would be absolutely thrilled to hear that, particularly in relation to our population who are living with CHARGE syndrome, because he's been fighting for this for 20 years, I think, to be taken on. So it is really important that if there are individuals who strongly feel about this, that yes, we need to look at within our population. Now, probably the first components of that will be within an isolated group members within our deafblind population. So chances are it will be looking at CHARGE syndrome is probably our key point of call to start with, because there is previous research there is previous acknowledgement of this, and it would most important that particularly David was saying as well was looking at the clinical aspects of it. And when we look at doing these assessments, knowing that the assessments just don't fit our deafblind population, so they're not valid in the point of research. So we need to be able to probably narrow down a field of individuals that we're choosing to do this research, and CHARGE is probably the most obvious one to choose first. And ideally, we'd be looking at getting a more valid assessment process for those individuals, primarily as our first start.
Thanks, Melissa. Melanie speaking. And, thinking, that great starting point, and encouraging clinicians to just start the conversation and start thinking about it, because that's where your database kind of starts and grows from. Yeah. We have a compliment for you, Melissa, from David Brown himself. He wants to thank you for the presentation and bringing this topic into the field of deaf blindness. I learned a lot. And then another question back to assessment. So who can do assessments for interoception in deaf blindness, or what qualifications do you need to have to administer the assessments?
Look, at this stage, our occupational therapists that are involved in supporting individuals with deaf blindness, the majority of the occupational therapists have this initial skill. Talking to OTs here, is part of their initial training that they do, particularly, so I'm speaking from a Western Australian perspective, but interoception is part of their initial training. Whether they've gone on to have experience in that area, the majority will have experience, but they will have experience within our individuals who are living on the autism spectrum. And so what we need is for our individuals who are OTs who work within our deaf blind field to be supported, or to access extra information from that field. However, in saying this, there are individuals, and these are OTs, because the reason I heard the word interoception was because I was sitting listening to an OT and physio speak at the CHARGE pre-conference in Perth in 2022. And so there are individuals out there, and she's an OT from Queensland, and there may be someone that are listening today that might be able to remind me of her name. So there are individuals out there, but our OTs are probably our first port of call, and this is a physio saying this, first port of call, because they do have that in their basic training modules.
And Melanie speaking, and that overlay of, always putting that deafblind lens over your interpretations as well. Yeah. And trying to understand the effect of that dual sensory loss and the impact there, which is different for everyone.
It's very different, and you've got that, the additional components of those external senses that are altered in our group of individuals, while within that autism spectrum field, it's quite different, because we may have the hypersensitivity and overload there, and within our field, initially we've got actually the limitation within some of those senses, so the decrease there.
And okay, that leads me to a question of my own while we wait for any more audience members to have a think and pose more questions. So it's going back to your case example, and where this particular person's foundation for the beginning of their kind of mindfulness and reflection and implementing the strategies that were going to help them kind of return to a state where they could carry on doing what they were doing. And eye contact was one of those, was her particular foundation. So we're assuming there that she has enough functional vision for eye contact to be meaningful. So my question is, do you kind of have any observations or examples or that spring to mind where eye contact couldn't be used as a foundation due to like the level of vision, so eye contact wouldn't be meaningful to a particular person? Are there other examples that might provide a foundation or that spring to mind for other individuals?
Yeah, and particularly this Ms. X that we will use, for her and that was to help her focus and probably limit the amount of external input that she was getting, because when she got the overload, it was often in a room that was very crowded and something had happened that gave her additional external sensation that then allowed her not to be able to control her emotions or what she was feeling. So for her, very particularly, it was the eye contact, because then it was just a one-on-one. I'm looking at you. Yes, I'm connected. Now I will go through this strategy process. What you've got to look at is, again, within our deaf-blind field, our tactile use is so important with whatever we do. And so in another setting, with an individual that's only just started using this process, who lives with congenital deaf blindness, it is a purely tactile thing. So it is a particular shoulder touch. So it's on the rounded part of the shoulder, and it literally is. And it's for this individual, right hand on my left shoulder, and my hand on their left shoulder, their hand on my right shoulder. But initially what it is the individual that's supporting them actually places their hand on their shoulder. And then we wait until the individual reciprocates. And that's our start point. So it's quite different. And it's a much slower, more focused process, because, again, the strategies are quite different. Without vision, we're not using the Auslan boys for our points and things like that. It's much more tactile. So it's a quite different approach, and that was the best place. We tried using it on different parts of the arm, but what was happening is that we were getting gripping starting and things like that. So other things were coming into play. So in fact, it ended up being this rounded ball shape of the shoulder, which would end up being the best position to trial that.
Yeah. It's Melanie speaking. I love that example. And it's, it's kind of like very much like a tactile form of eye contact. I'm attending to you, and you know that I'm attending to you, and now you're attending to me, and I know that you're attending to me, which is exactly what eye contact does. And the client has to initiate it in the way that they have to initiate the eye contact, and that indicates the readiness to proceed. And I'm noticing that there was often that a lot more time involved in that process, and patience.
A lot more time and a lot more in the preparation of finding the best place to do that tactile. That process in itself, again, we talk about periods of calm where we're trialing these things, that itself took 6 weeks to actually just come up with that stage where both the individual would respond and feel comfortable, and the individual that was supporting them also felt comfortable with that type of touch.
We have another question that's come through. This is about your case example, Miss X. Over what period of time did the intervention occur, and how long before she was initiating and self-regulating?
Look, again, the time taken in the first place, it was over a 6-week period of time to do the whole process for this individual. And whilst they were working with that, the communication guide, this process worked extremely well. But we're also aware that often an individual is supported by many people. So whether it's in a professional sense from a support worker, or whether it's within the family situation, or whether it's at a professional level with a therapist, ideally the skill set you're providing to the individual is so that they can take some of that responsibility themselves to go through this method. But it's also important to make sure that everyone else is aware of this method. And the most constant people involved in this process are the family or the caregivers. And so they need to be involved to be able to not only agree with the process and be able to use it effectively as well to keep it going. Because sadly, what happens is that at a worker level, there are changes. For some reason, there are changes in employment, changes this. And that's where we have our major issue, is that unless there is good then training of the next person coming in, something happens within that process and that strategy isn't used as effectively, but it may be that they're missing out on a component. So the hardest part is we need to be core, and again, remembering that the core is the individual and the family and caregivers around them to get this process correct, because sadly, you have a change of staff and some of that information gets lost in the process. And that's a sad reality of what we also live with.
Mm-hmm. It's Melanie speaking. Yes, they, like in NDIS term, goal achieved for that
Yes.
particular partnership. But for this partnership, that partnership, and any new partnerships that come along in the meantime, it's almost, you know, reverse back a bit and build that relationship, build that understanding, and get those strategies working again. Yeah, so it's almost, you know, never fait accompli, never accomplished, truly.
Exactly. And I think that's why
partnerships and people are so fluid. There was a kind of an addendum to that previous question about how many hours of deafblind consultant time was required, and I think maybe that next part of the conversation almost answers itself. Like initially, but
to be honest, and to give credit to Linny Oliver, in the situation of Ms. X, Linny was the one who primarily worked, and so as a communication guide, she worked completely with that individual and worked through the process, versus when I was with someone that I've been working with in the area that I work in, where we don't have communication guides with the experience that Linny has, and so it has been primarily at a deafblind consultant level. So yes, that is then I'm saying, you know, quite intensely over that 6-week period. However, we are working within jointly within the support worker and the family and caregiver at the same time. So the deafblind individual works those initial strategies going, but there's a lot of practice and repetition that happens, and that's done at the level of the support worker, because we don't have the communication guides down south, and the family and caregivers.
Yeah. So sometimes it's Melanie speaking. Sometimes it's, you know, an easily predictable finite amount of hours for deafblind consultancy, but more often because of the lack of skill set or awareness of deafblindness that you might be working with, you've got to build that first. And the question almost becomes, how long is a piece of string? So always be generous with your I think your prediction of deafblind consultancy hours. If you don't use them, great, but I'll guarantee you probably always will.
Exactly.
So I think that pretty much brings us to the end of our audience questions. I don't see any more coming through. So I will wrap up there with a great thank you, Melissa, for starting this conversation and you know, bringing it to the forefront of the minds of the people who are practicing, working and living deafblindness. And I look forward to the conversations that are going to ensue because of this, and you know, future watchers who start thinking more about this thanks again, Melissa, but also thank you to our interpreters, Brooke Tapier and Marie Hunter, for your excellent work in providing access to the to this webinar for the deaf community, and to our live captioner, Lee Smith.